Lately I've been playing a lot of Elden Ring, so when I found one of my favourite characters on My Mini Factory and a beautifully detailed sculpt, available free of charge, I had to give it a go. Stay tuned for some tips on how to paint this fantastic model.
Well then, shall we?
First step was to print the model. Luckily the geometry is fairly easy to work with, so I can print with minimal supports. I just angled the model slightly so that it didn't miss any of the detail on the face. I was a bit worried the chin would get cut off if I didn't angle the model. The model was being printed at 80% of its original scale. This will allow it to fit nicely on the build plate of my Anycubic Photon Mono SE printer. This is a resin printer, but you can also print this model with a filament printer. Once everything was prepared, I printed it. The total print time was about 3.5 hours, then cleaned and cured the model. This was the end result. Turned out pretty well and has a bit of weight to it. I didn't realise how solid the centre was going to be. If I print this again, I would definitely try to hollow it out a little bit more to save on resin. To prime the model, I'm using Vallejo Black Surface Primer through an airbrush. You definitely don't need to use an airbrush for this step, but if you paint a lot of models, it would definitely make it a lot quicker. You may be wondering, why black? This character is mostly bright colours. Well, by base coating it black, it means that I don't really have to worry about shadowing it later. Especially since the next step is to use acrylic ink to do a zenithal highlight, which will hit the areas of the model where natural light will hit it. For this I'm using a Liquitex titanium white with 1 to 2 drops of cerulean blue hue to tint it towards the blue end of the spectrum. For the zenithal technique, I'm firing down on the model from an approximate 70-degree angle. I prefer to use ink for the highlight because it tends to have smaller pigments than paint, so you get a lot less speckling. If you don't have an airbrush, you can achieve a similar result by dry brushing with a soft brush like a makeup brush. You take the acrylic paint, don't water it down, remove most of the paint from the brush onto paper towel, and then use downward strokes on the model. This may take some practice, but you can make it look just as good without using an airbrush. After the initial coats, I added a few more drops of blue to my airbrush cup to target a few areas where I wanted it to have a stronger blue. Once done, I left the model to dry for a few hours. Acrylic ink takes a lot longer to fully dry and cure than acrylic paint. If you start painting the model too soon, you may find that the ink reactivates and starts to run, and it's not nice when that happens. If you're really eager, you can give the model a coat of varnish after an hour or so, and this will protect the layer of ink. Now it is time to paint her. Ranni is an interesting character to paint as her palette is fairly muted, with not a lot of variation in colour. So my approach will be mostly to use shades and contrast paints, as this way I can tint the model towards particular colour schemes without drastically changing it. I'm using Citadel Snakebite Leather here, which probably looks a bit too warm for this palette, but again, we can use contrast and shade to bring the colour back into alignment. I'll show you what I mean by this soon. Next, I'm going to work on the areas that should be a bright white, such as this pattern on the hat and the straps on Ranni's cloak. While that is drying, I'm going to add some depth to her hair with using a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade. This will also give her hair more of a blue tint. Now to normalise the colours on the cloak by coating it in Citadel Apothecary White. This will help meld the colours together and make it feel more part of the model rather than being very bright and very separate. The cloak itself needs a bit more warmth to the colour, so we're going to be brave and use a coat of Agrax Earthshade. Don't worry if this makes it a bit too dark, as we will lighten it up with a highlight. Highlights are another great way to normalise the colour palette. Here I'm using a very light blue to go over the hair and cloak. I'm using a makeup brush and removing most of the paint on paper towel, using downward strokes to make sure that only paint gets on the most raised parts of the model, and keeps it nice and dark in the recesses. Next I'm using some white and light blue to add some volume to her dress and some detail to her hands using a medium brush. I'm mostly focusing on the high points, but it's also worth remembering how light interacts with fabric and trying to highlight the most appropriate areas. Don't forget that the hat is also in the light, so it needs some heavy highlights as well. I like the texture on the hat, so I opted to use a dry brush to try and maintain a lot of that texture. Now, one more detail that I keep noticing in the cutscenes is that Ranni often has snow on her hat, and it looks like she had just been walking through part of a blizzard. So I want to capture some of that detail using Vallejo ground texture snow. If this looks too bright, you can reduce it using Apothecary White again. I have a rubber brush that I use to apply the ground texture. I'm using very small quantities just to add little flakes of snow all over a hat. I want the effect to be fairly subtle. I'm also going to use this effect on her cloak and shoes and just try and focus areas where snow would naturally land. Once that is done, I gave the model a coat of satin varnish and here is the end result. I really enjoyed working on this model. It was interesting to work with a more muted palette and trying to capture how the character looked in game. Those familiar with this channel might notice that it's been a few weeks since I last uploaded. It wasn't due to a shortage of content. I have a lot of cool things that I want to share soon, including an introduction to using LEDs in models and also techniques for painting tanks. The reason I haven't made much content is a mix of my day job being very busy and Elden Ring captivating me. I've really enjoyed this game, especially Ranni's quest line. I think it is healthy to have a bit of variety to avoid burnout, but now I'm super excited to get back into some miniature painting content. So please subscribe if you would like to give me some encouragement and also to see my future videos. I like to mix them up with some Warhammer stuff, but also more different things like this where I paint models from video games and explain the process. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, please check out my other videos. Thanks for watching and I hope to see you again next time.